Welcome to the debriefing for Flights of Foundry. This was a really cool project that we are happy that we did that was really, really successful. And we're going to just sort of blow through a quick summary of how we did what we did and get to lessons learned, and then just kind of a dissecting of some of the budgetary stuff behind it. And then there will be lots of questions. So we're starting out here with what we had when we began. Dream Foundry has a 5-member board. We had 5 official staff members. In addition to the board, there's one person who wears both hats, is both staff and board. We had about $1,000 on hand that we could spend. Some of that was money we got from a restricted grant. So while it was liquid money, if we spent it in, we were only allowed to spend it in certain ways. And if we spent it in other ways, we were going to have to make that up with money later on and pretend we hadn't done that. That was a nervous-making thing. Our mailing list had about 270 people on it, and we had a social media presence of less than 300. For anybody in the audience who knows advice about Kickstarters and crowdsourcing and whatnot, you will notice that the magic number of 1,000 followers is nowhere present in our actual social media footprint. That made pivoting to something untested really exciting. So our initial scope, our outline of kind of what we thought a reasonable ideal case scenario for a convention looked like was about 8 hours of programming a day. It was definitely going to be free to attend with a donation suggested. That was sort of required by our organizational principles. We will not paywall anything as an organization. But also we were doing this as our main fundraiser rather than doing a Kickstarter. So we needed people to give us money. Based on that and based on some budgetary calculations for what we needed to make in order to stay solvent and functioning as an organization, we determined that 130 attendees who each donated $30, which is what we were suggesting as our donation, would keep us going pretty comfortably, give us a little bit of wiggle room to grow with. And we sort of spitballed that as maybe we would get it with about 300 attendees. We were wrong about all those things. I'm just going to tell you that I'd like ruin the spoil, like none of the, like other than it was free to attend. That's about the only thing that we stuck all the way through to the ending. What we actually wound up with was over 1,200 registrants. Our peak attendance on all of our main streams was over 700. So that was for any given, if you think of it as a hotel room, the fullest point for each of those streams was over 700 people. So that was a lot. We nearly filled 48 full hours of continuous programming. We did this entirely with 26 total volunteers, and that included during event support staff. Our mailing list now has over 1,300 subscribers. And if you do the math on the 130 attendees at $30, you get a number that's in $4,000-ish. And what we actually wound up raising was closer to 10. So that prompts the question of how on earth did we do that? Before I get into anything, I just want to flag, we got incredibly lucky. Given the moment that we were doing things in, people were extraordinarily generous and extraordinarily giving, and we got away with things that you could not normally get away with. So we're about to explain a whole lot of stuff that we did that, we did right and we did well. But even with all of that having been done right, we would not have had the same event if we had not been given things beyond what we were necessarily strictly entitled to. And that just cannot be said enough. So I want to make that really clear. We are aware of that, and that is a thing that anybody should be aware of. We're very grateful for it. But at the same time, if you are planning an event, you need to keep in mind that we're not offering you anything that is a guaranteed path to success. This is more a how do you optimize what you have available to you kind of thing. So I just want to frame that really carefully. My background is actually as a project like my professional background is actually as a project manager doing implementations of converting analog workflows to digital workflows. So we planned this an awful lot like how I used to do things in my old job. So we had 5 phases. I actually made up the names for these while writing up the documentation after the convention. I did not actually formalize name phases during the convention at all, but this makes it easier to talk about. So we'll call them startup, establishment, cultivation, pre-event prep, and event go live. Startup was just the phase right up front. Did we break these out? Yeah, we did break these out. Advanced slides. So startup was the phase right up front where we were just kind of outlining what it is that we were actually going to do. What are the fundamental things that we are after achieving here? No paywall was made explicit right up front. That was an organizational requirement. We didn't want to have workshops and special sessions be first come, first served. There was just no way we could conceive of where there wasn't going to be some sort of kind of unjust barrier in place with that technique, because there were going to be limitations on time of day, would intrinsically disenfranchise certain time zones, people with more reliable internet connections, blah, 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 blah. So we did not want to have a method that was sort of going to be intrinsically limiting in that way, with the acknowledgement that like having a perfectly fair method is not possible, but some methods are better than others. We needed to have a mechanism that was going to make collecting donations easy. While we didn't want there to be a paywall, we also didn't want there to be any friction between people and their wallets if they wanted to hand their wallets over to us. We also needed to have infrastructure to run multiple streams of programming over the course of potentially 48 hours. It came to our attention later in the process that it is not normal to do multi-streams of programming at virtual events, that's not a common thing. And we just sort of assumed by default that we would do that because that's how conventions tend to go.
Hey.
And look what happens when you don't know what you're doing.
Jessica, I'm going to interrupt you because we have a thing.
What is the thing?
The thing is that this platform we're testing has a secret limit to how many people can connect, and it is evidently 20.
Oh dear.
It lied to us with lying. And so there are a bunch of people who can't connect, and so I think that we should probably pivot.
Oh, is it time to go back to the PowerPoint?
Yes, actually it is. Now that I'm completely pink.
I've got like 4 more hours of material. I could keep embarrassing you for a while.
It's good. It's already 6:25. We're behind schedule now because of tech fail. So let's move on.
All right. Well, stay after class if you want to hear more funny stories about Syslin. So during the startup phase, we had a couple of things that were sort of predetermined or that were our vision for the event. I'd already covered several of these bullet points. We decided really fast that, one, we needed to have some sort of live chat option. That was in all of the advice for how one does a virtual event that we scoured ahead of making this decision. That being, Syslin went to a seminar and took a lot of notes, was what that preliminary research was. So we decided the top choices were Slack and Discord. We went with Discord. As somebody who is on 5 or 6 different Slacks, Discord was super the right choice. I've been really happy with that. And we also had a no trolls allowed as just sort of a fundamental operating principle right up front, which meant that a lot of our decisions were made based on ensuring that we were not going to be allowing trolls and that any trolls who tried to show up were going to be easily discouraged and sent on their way. Those decisions intrinsically required actions. This is when we started recruiting guests of honor. This is when we identified dates for when we were going to have the event. The date deciding mechanism basically came down to we had to have the money before the end of June. And we didn't want to conflict with other major industry events. And also the world was changing in bad ways very quickly. So the sooner we had the event, the less likely it was going to be that assumptions that were accurate up front would change out from under us mid-process. So we said mid to late May, whichever weekend didn't have a major thing. Between WisCon and the Nebulas, that left us with the weekend we wound up on. The establishment phase. This is where a lot of the work got going. One of the first things that happened was we sent out a survey saying, hey, are you interested in volunteering? The second thing that happened was after using that survey to identify people to staff teams with, we had a 5-person programming team, and they sent out a survey to find out what kind of programming people wanted to do. This was the beginning of what wound up becoming the entirely too many forms process. I think if we had done this over more than 7 weeks, the number of forms we had would have been less of an issue. But depending on how you were interacting with us, there was anywhere between 3 and 7 forms you might have been asked to fill out over the whole process. And that was just too much. That did not work out. People missed forms, and then the forms became less useful to us. We did a lot of research and testing for different registration and programming workflows for anybody who hasn't done any convention planning, or possibly this is even more different for virtual events than for physical spaced ones. Those workflows influence each other a whole lot. The registration team was the one on point for picking the registration software, but the registration software actually had major implications for how programming was going to get implemented. So those wound up being kind of joint decisions that the registration team spearheaded. Having it set up that way worked really well for us. The programming team was busy collecting interest and identifying people we wanted to invite explicitly onto programming, whereas the reg team, since they were already doing software research, expanding their scope on what software they were researching, especially because it was an integrated workflow, made a lot of sense. We didn't have to do a whole lot of research in terms of which platforms we were going to stage the event on, because we had sponsors offer us their streams, and we weren't going to say no to being offered free high capacity streams. So if you want to know how we decided to do GoToWebinar and Zoom, the answer is because that was what was offered to us without cost. And so instead, a lot of our work around that became how to make sure that those platforms did what we needed them to do, rather than deciding what we wanted and finding a platform that matched that. We finalized our guest of honor lineup. This was one of the places where we got very lucky. The only person, we only got 2 no's in the process of recruiting for guests of honor. One of them was from Ken, who, when I asked him initially to be a guest of honor, told me no. I was asking him for translation, and he very graciously explained that he was concerned he was getting pigeonholed as a translator when actually his fiction matters more to him, so he was going to decline. Also, here are all these other translators that don't get enough attention. I will never stop telling the story about how Ken told me no. He did follow up by saying yes when I said, well, I was being a chicken. I was hoping that if things went poorly, I could double you up as the fiction guest of honor. So how about you just do that instead? And he was fine with that. Then the person that we initially reached out to for podcast guest of honor took so long telling us no that we just decided to not bother continuing to recruit after that. But other than that, everybody said yes right off the bat, which made it very easy to fill those slots. And a lot of people were very generous about using their personal connections to let us get a hold of people we wouldn't have been able to get a hold of in order to invite them. So that was really nice. And again, a big part of our success, because a lot of people, we had a lot of credibility, and a lot of people were willing to work with us based on the guest of honor lineup that we had. So it was one of those things that once we had that in place, it fed into a lot of our future success. We created email addresses on the fly so much. Oh my goodness. We did not have the convention website run the same way that our organization website is run. We self-managed that, whereas we have an external sysadmin for the normal site. And that actually wound up being really valuable to us because there's a bit of a time delay between a request and an implementation. Normally with our organizational stuff, that doesn't matter, but given how quickly we were doing the convention, being able to have an email address about 30 seconds after we wanted it was really useful. And the other big thing from this phase is we had a giant org doc, and it was just a shared Google doc that anybody working on the convention had access to. And with a consistent repeated reminder that they should update it with what they were doing, links to any of their internal team docs. We were basically trying to create a situation where if anybody mysteriously disappeared for whatever reason, we could drop somebody else into their spot and the org doc would pretty much point them to what they needed in order to get up and running. Cultivation phase. This is where we opened up registration, which meant that a lot of our workflows had been locked into place. We, at this point, wound up adjusting scope from our original outline of how we were going to do things. At the end of the day, we had two main teams, registration and programming, and then a couple of just sort of generic people who would fill in as needed. We had originally scoped many more teams than that, but we could not get people to staff them. And so this was the part where we decided which elements were things that were going to be put under the purview of the existing teams and which things were things that we were going to cut. We wound up deciding to cut things that we sort of added in a little bit at the last minute, and we wound up deciding to not cut things that at the end of the day I think we actually should have. So workshops and small sessions wound up falling under the registration team's purview because in this moment, once registration opened up, a lot of their immediate pressing work was done for a little while, and so they had some spare time, whereas the programming team was still kind of hitting their stride in terms of the bulk of their work. That meant that two people wound up handling what was easily at least the second most complicated, hairy problem that we had for the entire convention, which was not nearly enough people. We did tech checks with all of the guests of honor very early during this phase. We were doing this entirely because we were afraid that if somebody had a really bad microphone or a really low quality camera where we wouldn't be able to see or hear them, we needed to have time in order to source a fresh webcam or microphone or whatever in order to give to them. We had some people who were like, maybe I could loan you equipment. We had some people who were like, if you remember March and April, you could not get a microphone or a camera for love or money. And so that was actually a real concern for us, that we would wind up in a situation where we really wanted to get somebody a camera and not have one available. So we wanted to identify that pretty quickly up front. We had part of our budget sort of earmarked to facilitate that. We wound up doing the tech checks. We wound up not needing to get anybody equipment, but having done them at that point to have been very valuable. One, because it meant we were more familiar with the platform for conversations that we had later with our sponsor than we would have been otherwise. It helped us sort of preemptively identify problems we were going to have because we had had that experience. And it also gave the guests of honor plenty of time ahead of time to practice things and identify things that they were nervous about and would want to practice more in the lead up to the convention, so that they could be pretty confident. And it is just good practice for a convention that your guests of honor be confident and have a good time. So anything that you can do is good for that. So having those checks early, even though we didn't wind up identifying any equipment needs, wound up paying dividends for us. This was also where we came up with the naming scheme for all of our different spaces. The shout out to anybody who recognized the Three Musketeers theme and enjoyed it along with me. Apologies to everybody else who found it really baffling. But nothing beats pulpy old French novels, other than whatever it is you think beats pulpy French novels. Pre-event prep the week before the event. This is where things started to get very tense, not least because when we released the program, we went from having been very steadily on track to have about 400 people and get about $4,000, which you'll remember was our initial goal, to a rather stark increase on both our rates of registration and our rates of donation. And this was visible to us within hours of releasing the programming. I don't think we pulled out a screenshot of the Eventbrite registration, but it was a very steady, gradual line in the weeks leading up to the program release, with a very stark asymptote the moment the program was released. And that last week was a very steep curve where all of a sudden everybody decided to come to our party. which was very cool, but also a little bit stressful because all of a sudden we had a lot more people we had to plan for. Part of that is because the program wound up massively exceeding our initial expectations. You may recall that we were hoping for about 8 hours a day over the weekend. My exact words to the programming team when we had our initial meeting, when they said, well, what is it we're going for, was, well, in an ideal world, we'd have all 7 streams full for 48 hours and have global reach the whole time. But I don't think it's reasonable to ask 5 people to put that together in 7 weeks. So if you can get me 8 hours a day each day, we won't be embarrassed, and I think that's good. I don't think they heard the balance I meant there, but that turned out to be really good. They pulled it off. It was amazing. So any of those people, please don't offer them any kind of work or opportunities that will keep them from being able to work on my stuff in the future. I still want them. I like them a whole lot. But if you want people who are heroically capable of achieving amazing things, check out our programming team. This program was actually so extensive that we destroyed the standard GoToWebinar workflows for our stream sponsor. Our stream sponsor was a giant IT security firm. They were pretty robust in their normal planning, and they had never seen an event like this, and we basically completely fundamentally destroyed all of their capacity and assumptions about how their workflows were designed, and then had to at the last minute completely redesign them in order to accommodate it. Fun things to do in the days leading up to your convention. So in that last week, things that we had to do were recreate all of those workflows, train all of the event volunteers. We did not actually have the staffing for the event that we needed at all. So in addition to training them, we were trying to recruit them in the first place. Do any final tech checks. We also did trainings that were optional for anybody who wanted to be a panel moderator. We had to set up the Discord to prepare it for the convention, do any final marketing pushes, stare at the rates at which people were registering for the convention with manic horror might be the best way to explain it. It was really, really awesome and also deeply terrifying. All of those final details leading up, that was kind of all in that one last week. It was a little bit intense. And then the actual event itself, we had set up so that there was on-the-spot tech support done via the Discord. So if somebody had a question, they could just ask it right there, and anybody who was around could potentially answer it. We, again, had a lot of flexibility with our processes and our options, as you just witnessed an unplanned practical demonstration of. Because of the way we tend to plan things, when things go wrong, we usually know what second best was. And if first best just broke, well, second best just got promoted. And so we did a lot of kind of knowing what the breadth of options were, and then making sure that whoever wound up in the situation where things broke felt enabled and empowered to go ahead and make that pivot. We were very big on "this is your kingdom, please go forth and rule it" kinds of approaches. This was also, we had a fundraising push. The moment it was clear that all of a sudden a lot more people were going to show up to our party than we had planned, we were closing in on that $4,000 that we were hoping to raise. I made the comment, which everybody then took very seriously, that if we raised $10,000, I would live stream cooking the entire Consuite menu, which was a different meal every 4 hours of the convention. I claimed at the time that there was no way that could happen because we weren't even halfway there yet, and this would be terrible, and oh no, please don't make me. I'll save you some suspense. We raised the $10,000 and the live streaming will be happening. We're in the process of getting that scheduled. I think the poll for which day of the week either closes today or has already closed. I don't remember, but there was a Twitter poll very recently to pick which day of the week we're going to be doing that live streaming on. So that is coming. The possibly the most fun part of the event go live, Sislin and I keep almost completely opposite schedules, where I'm up all night and she gets up stupid early and is up all day. But there was about a pretty reliable 4 to 5 hour gap in the day where we were both not around. And we both were really nervous about that. It was fine. Nothing burned down. This was the most used GIF in communication amongst the teams. And it did wind up capturing the feeling for the backside of things during the event. We felt pretty good about how things were going. So we're to the lessons learned portion. I'm going to pause. Sislin, have any questions popped up?
No, we're pretty good. Well, one question popped up, but I answered it in chat. The question was how long these different phases lasted.
That depended on the phase.
Yes, and I've basically answered it. Startup was about a week. Pre-event was, of course, a week. And then everything else was kind of smushed together in about a month-ish, a month and a week in between there.
Yeah.
So that's how long things lasted.
Yeah, and we're going to also be releasing a very long, detailed doc that goes into all of this in much more depth, with a lot more sort of analysis. Officially, a draft of that will be released today, but we're going to be a little sketchy about the definition of release and also of draft. I'm just, as the person who's like, oh, I thought this was going to be a 9,000 word doc, and clearly I was wrong by at least a half and maybe a third. That it will have a lot of detail, is what I'm saying. So if you have specific questions about any of that there will be more details available to you in something that's looking like it wants to be 50 pages long. So brace yourselves. It'll be fun reading. The reason we did the PowerPoint was because it was the only place to have pretty pictures and colors, and the document's going to be very dry. All right, in that case, I will transition to the lessons learned phase. This is not everything we learned, but these are the highlights. These are the things that are most likely to be applicable to other people who are thinking about going down this particular path for themselves. So one thing that we learned is that it is definitely possible to do something like this with minimal budget and a very tight timeline. Again, people were extremely generous with their yeses, and we got very lucky. Part of that is because just of who we were as an organization and the work that we had already done and the people that we had in place. Part of that was just the moment. Everybody was kind of looking for an opportunity to do something that would let them feel good about things without having to sort of engage with what was going on in the wider world. And I think that a lot of it was just because it was so ambitious, because it was a short timeline, especially given some of the other programs that we're running at the same time and not getting the same response to, knowing that it was only going to be take up time for X amount of weeks that were fairly short. People were willing to commit to that in a way that, for example, when I'm trying to get things set up for the fall, people are not comfortable doing right now. So I think that just some of the implausibility of the premise actually helped us achieve it. We definitely recommend having a dedicated chat platform independent of wherever it is that you're doing your streaming. You saw the Discord rescue even this event a bit today. It gives you a centralized place to do communication that is independent of anything that might be going wrong elsewhere. It also meant that when we had other channels that were specifically chat, it was already a place where people were, so those other channels were more likely to get used. And that wound up being a source of a lot of the sort of the authentic socializing and networking and funness and conventions feelingness of the event was how that interaction wound up happening. If we had been having a lot of that conversation just happen in GoToWebinar or in Zoom, I don't think we would have had the same effect. The org doc, whenever you are doing a large event like that, make everyone fill out the org doc. They don't like it. They don't want to do it. They will get behind. Have somebody whose job it is to just constantly gently but firmly remind them that they have updating they need to do, please. It's one of those things that is just extra work that everybody has to do right up until it saves your bacon. So one of the big things we learned is that first come, first serve seat assignment, while it has problems with accessibility and fairness, is actually significantly more tenable to implement than a lottery system. A lottery system wound up being much, much, much more difficult than we envisioned, partly because we wound up having more people and more programming items than we had expected to when we made the decision to do a lottery, but also just because that is, in fact, harder to do. I am not saying that we don't recommend doing a lottery. As of now, our expectation is that is how we will continue to do those sessions in the future. But also, one of the areas where we're going to be doing the most work in terms of expanding, supporting, building different infrastructure, picking apart everything that went wrong in order to make it not go like that again, this is the area where a lot of that is going to be focusing. Additionally, streamlining communication with participants. We mentioned the too many forms problem. Again, the next event is going to be done on a much longer timeline. So it's not going to be like we asked people to fill out 7 forms in 6 weeks. But rather than do 7 forms in 6 weeks, I think if we could get it down to like 3 forms in 6 months, that might be a goal for us to aim for. We also just have identified having more robust and extensive Discord roles associated with the convention. That's specific to that platform. If you're using a different chat platform, that might not necessarily apply. But this was definitely one of those things where as the convention event itself progressed, we were like, oh, it would be nice if we had set this up because this would be a moment where using that would be great. And so having a role specifically for people who were there for the convention, because we were using the regular Dream Foundry Discord server, there were people who were there who were not necessarily convention attendees. And so, making an announcement to the server as a whole for a convention specific thing was potentially very obnoxious and something that we did not want to do. Whereas if everybody had a participant role, we could have just limited notifications to that subset of people. 10 minutes between sessions wound up being a little bit tight, even though nobody had actual commute time. So expanding that a little bit, doing things to kind of just make transition from one space to another smoother would be a priority for next time. Securing event volunteers. We got a little bit, we thought we were very clever when we decided to go ahead of the other major conventions. We happened before WisCon, we happened before the Nebulas. And part of that was so that we wouldn't be stepping on anybody's toes. We wouldn't be, trying to compete with them for space or resources or attention. Nobody would be burned out on going to virtual conventions yet. What we didn't anticipate was that those were much larger, more famous, more popular conventions. So everybody who was planning to support a virtual convention signed on with them before they had even heard that we were happening. That was a problem for us. That's a problem that's fixed by having a longer recruit period, by happening a different weekend. We're probably going to be earlier in the year next year. Really awkward for us was that Con Zealand wound up having mandatory planning weekend the same weekend as our convention. So some of our people who were initially very enthusiastic were also working on Con Zealand and disappeared from us. Like, they communicated, it wasn't anything awkward, but like that just wound up being bad luck. And so we wound up really flying by the seat of our pants with that in a way that was not awesome. We overcame it. The people who stepped up were fantastic, but I do not recommend not having enough people to actually staff all of the roles that you need at a minimum within 48 hours of your event going live. That's just not a great way to keep hair on your head if you have it. The other big thing, Twitter hashtags. We had official hashtags for the convention, and basically the moment the programming was released, people started wanting program item specific hashtags, which was not a thing that we really had the capacity to develop this time around. But given the persistence of people wanting that, we are definitely doing it next time. And now you can know that this is a thing that people are very interested in. Also, if you're on Discord, use bots. We had some bots in place that were sort of set up, and we didn't have them fully figured out ahead of the convention. And the little bit that they did work was really awesome, and we've got them working much better now for other things. Having bots around to do announcing, to do like quick orientations for people, highly recommended. Anything that you can sort of ease the burden on your actual human staff is really handy. And bots tend to be cute and well liked, so it's an interaction people like having. Our top tips for anybody, I'm going to pause for breath. Sislyn, questions?
No, I think we're good.
All right.
Well, there's been questions about the Discord. Oops, something just popped up, and I've been answering them. So there is a question about how important online security is, such as not using Zoom for the conference to the point of now not using Zoom. Like, I think they're asking, how come we Zoomed then and we're not going to Zoom now? Whoops.
So to be straightforward, the biggest reason that I've gone hardline no Zoom is because of their stance on explicitly stating in public out loud after the end of May, the reason that they will not encrypt end-to-end their free platform is so that they can collaborate with the police. And so that's a hard no for me. I will never work with Zoom again. I'm the president of the Dream Foundry, so when I have a hard no on a vendor, that means that the organization has a hard no on a vendor. That is the biggest reason that our stance has gone from reluctantly trying to work around their weaknesses to being a hard no. Zoom was a problematic platform anyway, but we were comfortable with the decisions we made around how to deal with that. There's actually a lot of there's a lot of time spent on discussing the things that we did to work with Zoom in the long document that's getting released. But that was part of why we did no recording on Zoom, is because there was not. Their security was so bad with their recordings that there was no way I felt like we could sufficiently warn people about the risks that they were engaging in by going into a recorded space. And we also didn't actually need to have all the space recorded. We wouldn't have wanted to record readings anyway, because that causes rights problems for the people doing the reading. So that was okay. And we had a lot of procedures in place to kind of thwart the known easy exploits with Zoom. But yeah, we're a hard no on Zoom now because snitches, basically.
Okay, question answered.
All right. Our top tips to you, should you want to try and do something like this. Your program is your best marketing tool by a whole lot, because, oh boy, were we putting in all kinds of charming hot air balloon and dragon pictures. Our guests of honor lineup was really useful. We got a lot of people, anytime we announced a new guest of honor, we got a lot of interest. But again, very steep curve the moment we released the program. We only had a week between when we announced the program and the event actually happened. And in that week, we had 800 people sign up. If we'd had 2 weeks, I don't necessarily think that means we would have had 1,600 people sign up. But I wouldn't be surprised if we hadn't gotten 1,200 extra people to sign up. So I don't think it was an error on our part that we only released the program a week before the convention, because it wasn't realistically plausible for us to have more time between those two events, because that would have just shortened the timeline we had for developing the program. But definitely when you are planning things, keep that in mind and establish your timelines accordingly. Definitely use a chat platform. It's also really, really useful, and I think that this was critical to how we managed to pull off things on a short timeline, is if you have your priorities and your goals for your event clearly determined ahead of time. We knew that this was going to be a Dream Foundry event, which had built-in values and standards for what it was going to be. We also knew that it was going to be our primary fundraiser for the year, which meant we needed to make it something that would be conducive to getting donations. And with those two things in place, a lot of decisions were sort of implicitly made for us, because in order to honor both of those things, it really narrowed our option space. It meant, for example, that several registration platforms that we researched were not even really worth considering past an initial glance, because their minimum, basically their free ticket still required $1. And there's a difference between free and $1. And we cared about that difference. So if the platform wouldn't let us do true free ticketing, then they weren't a contender. And that narrowed things down for us a whole lot. So if you have those things in place up front, then all of your decisions can follow from that. And then they're consistent in a way that is actually very useful as you plan your event. Be open about, like, we specify on the slide your volunteer shortages and needs, but just be open about all of your needs and the places where you're having trouble. In guest of honor recruiting, there were a couple of places where I was like, I really don't have good connections in this part of the industry, or this is not the part of the industry that I even engage in much as a consumer. And so I was fairly open with people where I was like, all right, people who are familiar with this area of the industry, where should I go looking for a guest of honor? What does a cool guest of honor look like, and who do you know? Just any kind of frank willingness to communicate about what it is that you need. People, again, frequently are willing to step up and offer things to you, and you don't know what opportunities might be just outside of your site, but actually within reach until you ask. Train all of your volunteers, including panel moderators, as much as you possibly can. People are very, very willing to expand beyond their comfort zone if they know that they're going to be backed up with training, or if they have already been trained. Anytime you can help somebody feel secure and confident, they are more willing to kind of push themselves on your behalf. And I don't mean that in sort of an exploitative, wring everything you can get out of your volunteers kind of way. But if you have when you are willing to proactively train and help people figure things out as an event culture around how you're running things, that creates sort of an acceptance and a support intrinsically in the culture that then helps people feel confident and empowered. And it gives them a positive experience, as well as making it easier for you to kind of work with what you have and against what you actually need. So just don't consider training something that you're tacking on at the end. Make that kind of one of the fundamental sort of things that you are doing as a function as part of your event planning. And then to every extent possible, do active training on the platform that you're going to be using for the actual virtual event. And try to keep your training sessions to 90 minutes or less, because human attention spans don't survive things beyond 90 minutes very well. An hour would be ideal, but if you're doing hands-on stuff where you're having people try different things out, you have to keep the size of the training session pretty small to make an hour work. But definitely try to keep it under 90 minutes. This can be hard, especially if you're in a situation where your platforms are being donated. A lot of our technical problems leading up to the convention were because we were using free GoToWebinar trials to do tech checks and training. And we were running into problems and bugs that we were 99.9% certain, and we turned out to be right, were just a consequence of because we were using a trial, but nevertheless made the tech checks and the trainings kind of caused headaches that were a problem. GoToWebinar hates me in ways I still do not understand. Like me personally, specifically, it would take away all of my buttons within half an hour of a training session starting. They would be there until half an hour before the training session started. So I was the one doing most of our training, and I always had to have somebody with me to press the buttons on my behalf.
I was the button buddy.
I had several button bunnies because we were doing a lot of training sessions that week. So if you can have access to the actual platform you're going to be using rather than cobbling it together with free trials, that's better. You might not need a button buddy because the buttons mysteriously vanish on you only when you need them. That was the part, whereas they would be there as long as I didn't need them. So more tips, always tip at least 20%. Checklists and workflow documentation for your live event are super, super important and extremely useful. We designed ours so that theoretically anybody who is reasonably comfortable with using web browser stuff could read the checklist and get the workflow right about 80% of, like, be 80% of the way towards the ideal fully trained setup. So like that level of detail for the checklist is what we were after. And we actually did some spot tests where I would hand something to somebody who hadn't done anything and said, you know, following this checklist, go do a thing. Let's see what happens. And if it wasn't close enough, we rewrote the doc. Have clear guidelines about how you want people interacting with your sessions and advertise those. And then again, bake in security as much as you possibly can. Just because I'm hardcore on Zoom does not mean that anybody is like morally compromised or like a bad person for using Zoom. They're free. Even for the things that aren't free, they're very cheap. There are a lot of reasons that just sheer pragmatic reality might require you to use them and like deal with what you got to deal with. But do keep in mind they are fundamentally insecure, and so that there are things that you're going to want to do and plan up front in order to deal with that. And there are a lot of resources out there for how to do that. And we can talk offsides if you want tips. And then one thing, and this is useful for during the convention, this is also useful for the lead up to the convention. You can burn out participants as much as you can burn out staff and support. So just be kind and be thoughtful about how you schedule things and how you plan things. Give people room to breathe. We thought 10 minutes between sessions was doing that, and I actually did not know until we were compiling this document that it hadn't been. So yeah, oops, sorry to everybody who was frazzled. But that's something where like you don't want to burn out your participants either. It's really easy for them to decide not to log back in when it's a virtual convention. You want them to kind of, if they have a good time, then they hang around, and that's what you want. We're to my favorite part of the presentation, which is the nitty gritty. All the parts are my favorite part, but there's a pie chart coming. I'm really excited about the pie chart. I'm just going to foreshadow that for you. So the brass tacks, this is sort of the can you, whoever you are, whatever organization you are, can you actually do this? We opened with, in terms of like people power, what our resources were. Here's what we wound up doing. Because you can spend a mind-boggling amount of money on a virtual convention, and there are all kinds of very attractive bells and whistles you can get, and a lot of them are they're valuable. They have a use, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can afford it. And in a lot of cases, a convention is better than the bells and whistles convention. We spent a total of $995 on Flights of Foundry, and only $680 of that came out of our actual existing budget. The rest of it was transaction fees for acquiring the donations. We didn't have a good grasp on that until after the event, but like we were trying to keep things under 1,000 is how we were ballparking things. That was incredibly cheap. The biggest reason we got away with that is because the really expensive part, the platforms, were donated to us by sponsors. I highly recommend not paying for the expensive things if you can find someone who will give them to you. Closed captioning, the live closed captioning we wound up doing was by far the biggest part of our budget on what we wound up spending. This is the pie chart that shows that to you. So the giant green section is what we spent on closed captioning. The PayPal and Eventbrite fees, like these two here, even combined, are less than that. Those were sort of the bulk. And it's a little disingenuous to call those expenses. Those didn't come out of our pocket. They just got in between what people tried to put in our pocket and us. The hosting and the domain, that was just for the website. Those were relatively cheap, pretty easy to do, though important, because that was how people found us, and that was where all of our information was centered. The website wound up being extremely important in that respect. I don't recommend trying to do this without one. I do want to note, you'll see on this pie chart SCAD. This is the software that we used to display our program and to sort of ensure that we didn't have any conflicts or anything like that. It was gorgeous. It worked really well, except for the couple of places where it face planted. We're really happy that we used it. It integrated really well with Eventbrite. We also got away with murder. I'm going to be real frank. We negotiated their price. They have their officially listed pricing. They have nonprofit pricing, which at the time was kind of like secret, not shared pricing. I don't know what their website looks like now. I negotiated them down from their secret nonprofit price, and then they didn't mention that price only covered your first 500 registrants, and that there was an additional $200 fee for every chunk of 500 after that. So had they charged us, even at the negotiated rate, what they meant to charge us, they would have cost us $600, 3 times as much as they actually did. But when I pushed back on that, and I was like, you did not mention that there were capacity limits on those fees, they were like, oops, our bad. I suspect I thought we were only going to have 400 people and possibly communicated that to them may have fed into it. So it's possible they got a little bit set up to make that error. I wasn't doing it on purpose, but also I didn't want to spend $600 on the programming software. So I'm not sorry. But just in terms of sort of your expectations for your budget, keep in mind that should have cost us, even at the negotiated rate, $600. And that is the end of the prepared slides. So we can move on to the Q&A, and we are only 10 minutes behind the intended time for us to be at this point.
I am watching for questions now. We had some questions about which ways SCAD fell down, and I've answered them over in YouTube. For other people, SCAD fell down for us with basically bugs that we helped them discover. Like, for instance, they displayed sessions that were before a certain time of the morning as being with the prior day instead of part of the day of, which makes sense for an in-person convention. You're probably staying up till 3 a.m. instead of getting up and doing things. But for a globally accessible 24-hour-a-day convention, it was actually completely wrong. So we pointed that out. They now have options to fix that. Also, we had to hack a lot to get things to display in a user's actual time zone. And those hacks were painful, and we didn't like it. And it was confusing because users would get emails at random parts of the day from their perspective when things were just starting over in Central Time, but not when things were just starting for them. So there were bugs like that. But those are things that they've worked on and that we helped discover. Yay, guinea pigs. So there's that. Let me keep watching for other questions. What did we use for closed captions? Yes, thank you. Jessica, do you have that information? I know I have it.
Give me 1 second and I will pull up the name. We hired a company and I was not the person on, I can't pull it up the way I was going to because I closed Discord so I wouldn't be distracted. It'll be 2 moments. We hired a closed captioning company charged by the hour. Our compliance officer actually took point on doing that. We wanted to have an accessibility team who would be in charge of sort of proactively researching what our potential risks and opportunities for accessibility would be, and then informing other workflows and whatnot. We did not get that team staffed, which did not mean that we weren't focusing on accessibility or considering that as we went. We just didn't have people where that was their primary job, was to pay attention to that for us. Closed captioning was something that we wanted to have early on. And that would have been one of the big goals for that team. Our compliance officer swooped in and made sure that we got some of that done. One of the things that we discovered fairly early on, which is part of why we weren't more proactive about getting it, is that closed captioning is extremely expensive. Software-based, Syslin, I'm echoey because you got me in both streams.
Okay.
Software-based closed captioning has some accuracy problems that are often hilarious, but not necessarily useful. But live human and interfaced closed captioning is highly skilled human interface labor. And so correctly, that is not cheap. So the company that we wound up hiring that from is my clever cheat for finding it in a hurry is not paying out. So I'm hiring them for 5 hours. And this is one of the ways in which SCED was very useful, is it told us which bits of programming had the most people saying they wanted to go to it. And so we just targeted off of sort of the top 15 items, which 5 hours were the one we were going to provide the closed captioning for, because that was what we knew we comfortably could afford. Having crunched the numbers post-convention and sort of gotten what we actually wound up spending things on in one place, we could have easily paid for 3 or 4 more hours. But okay. That doesn't, yeah.
I found the company. It's ACS Captions. That's the company that we used. I will put a link to them in various chats because there are so many chats now. Link here.
Thank you, Sislin.
I'm pretty great. It's true. Link here.
Yeah.
Link coming to YouTube.
Yeah. So in hindsight, with the post-convention crunching, we could have upped how much closed captioning we did because we spent less of our budget than we realized we were going to have spent. Realistically, though, given the number, even if we'd done 10 hours of closed captioning, given the sheer volume of programming we had, it was more of a token gesture than it was a real there's a difference between closed captioning 90% of the event and 1% of the event. And we were never going to get closer to the 90%. We were always going to be closer to the 1%. But it was really important to us that we at least established that much of a commitment to it. That is one of our top goals for next time around, is to have more closed captioning. I've actually already have somebody looking for grants and opportunities. We're not going to be able to do a convention of this size and pay fair market rate for the closed captioning out of our budget. We would spend every penny we got for it. But we are proactively looking for ways to make sure that just because that is true, that doesn't mean we don't have it. ASL translation is something else that I would really like to have, and that we're being pretty proactive about looking into for next time.
Please tell me that the Hangouts didn't end for everyone because I dropped connection.
I'm in Hangout.
Oh, good. Well, I'm not.
All right. Well,
fine.
I'll handle the Hangout. You're fine.
Good, because I can't watch it because I'm not in it now. Sorry.
That's cool. I'll keep an eye on the Hangout. So that's one of the big priorities for expanding for next year and doing a better job on. It was important to us that we at least made the gesture this year, but next year we have more time. We're going to have a better budget. Just a gesture isn't enough after your entry point. Other questions?
I'm not seeing any currently, but I can't watch all the spaces right now, unfortunately.
I'm watching the Hangout for you.
Okay.
I can't watch the YouTube, so you got to take that one.
I'm on it. Nothing currently on the YouTube. I think we've gotten everything from those folks, like all the questions they had. I am watching y'all YouTube. If you have more, please let me know.
I do want to proactively say while we have downtime, I think there are folks from FIA here. If y'all want to hit us off sides for anything, do.
Leaders at dreamfoundry.org. Please write to us.
Or roll up in the Discord, whatever. Or hit me wherever.
Yep. We're here for you.
You can have anything you want. Yes, more virtual conventions.
Okay. We're getting some thanks, and the document is indeed massive. You'll be able to beat whales to death with it, but don't. Whales are endangered. We'll be getting that done soon.
We committed to releasing a draft today. Whose bright idea was that, Cicely?
It was yours. If you have a really dumb question, and we probably don't remember who you are, but yes, we do, Tiffany. I know who you are. You can email us. We don't have to answer your question live in front of everyone. If you think it's dumb, that's fine. Feel free to email us. You can email us personally or jointly. If you email leaders, we'll both see it. You can also just email me, Cislin at Dream Foundry, or Jessica at Dream Foundry. We're fancy like that.
We're very obscure. If you know me by my pen name, Anea at Dream Foundry also winds up in my inbox. So if you cannot remember which name it is, both work.
Still watching.
Yeah. If people don't have questions, that's totally okay. We're scattered across 3 different spaces. So
4, and counting the Discord.
Right. So so we didn't follow our own advice, and we planned to do all of the chatting inside our main platform. And we have in the process demonstrated to you why not doing things the way that we tried to do them this time is our advice. So there you go. We've got a question in the Hangout about, was there a big whoops moment, such as the sked bugs or the time zone problems during the convention? The sked bugs were more irritating than like big whoops moments because they had a tendency to crop up during the slower portions of the convention. And so it was less of a crisis to deal with them. I think our biggest whoops moment was when church tried to destroy our convention. Sunday mornings, every church had their virtual services and brought down Zoom across a large portion of North America for several hours during our convention. Only 4 of our streams were Zoom based. So, and those were our smaller capacity streams. But that was still real awkward because there were, during those several hours, as many as 4 programming items that were being affected by it. We wound up pivoting pretty quickly to using video chat on Discord, which, just to give you an idea of kind of the circumstances the convention was being planned under, when we decided to go with Discord over Slack, neither of them, without paying a lot of money, gave you video options. And so streaming events or portions of the event on Discord wasn't even an option. Over the course of planning the convention, Discord introduced video for just people who were friends, and then expanded that to be for, a very limited capacity. And by the time the convention actually ran, they were a viable alternative to Zoom. And so we wound up pivoting to Discord because we had been sort of watching with amusement as they became more and more appropriate for what it was that we needed it as a potential Zoom alternative. So that was definitely kind of the biggest whoops moment, was all of a sudden half of our platform disappeared. And I have really enjoyed telling people who ask me how that convention I was planning went, that, church tried to take down my event.